Welcome to Making Michigan, the Bentley Historical Library's series on the history of the University of Michigan. I'm Andrew Rutledge, Bentley historian and research associate, and I'm very pleased to welcome all of you tonight to the historic Detroit Observatory, a division of the Bentley. And I'd also like to welcome our online audience on YouTube. Thank you all for joining us. Library's series on the history of the University of Michigan. Oops. I'm Andrew Rutledge. Let's mute that for a second. I'm sorry. I also want to welcome all of you and thank you for coming out on a really kind of depressingly cold spring evening. Thank you so much. But tonight we have a very exciting and I think important presentation. The Making Michigan series is to share stories and analyses of the history of the University of Michigan as broadly as possible. Most of these stories, I admit, are generally positive, for U of M has objectively done incredible things and has hundreds of achievements in education and research of which it is justly proud. But we've also had sessions discussing some of the many times Michigan has failed to live up to the values it professes and seeks to embody. For like any institution, or any individual for that matter, the history of the University of Michigan is complicated, a mixture of good and bad, noble intentions and ignoble deeds. Documenting, understanding, and sharing the university's history is also the goal of our speakers tonight, the Inclusive History Project. First charged by President Mary Sue Coleman and then again by President Santa Ono in 2022, the Inclusive History Project seeks to provide a critical re-examination of the university's history that stretches across all three of its campuses, Ann Arbor, Flint, and Dearborn, as well as to Michigan Medicine. Its goal is to better understand the full history of the university, including its record of inclusion and exclusion, and to consider what actions that history demands of the present. The Inclusive History Project's work is divided across a number of project sites. And tonight we are joined by the research team from one of those sites, the 1817 Project. Taking as its starting point a re-examination of the transfer of 1,920 acres to the newly founded University of Michigan by the Ojibwa, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations in the 1817 Treaty of Fort Meigs, the 1817 Project seeks to understand this transfer and the longer-term consequences of it in relation to broader histories of Native American land dispossession in the Great Lakes, it's a long day, of Native American land dispossession in the Great Lakes region. Its work encompasses research into the early history of the university and of Michigan territory, and also how this history has been represented, occluded, contested, and addressed through legal challenges and through Native student activism. We are joined tonight by several members of this project team. First, speaking virtually, is Professor Michael Widkin from the Department of History and the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race at Columbia University. A citizen of the Red Cliff Band of Lake Superior Ojibwa, he is a celebrated scholar of Indigenous and early American history with a particular focus on the Great Lakes and Upper Mississippi Valley. Among his many publications are An Affinity of Nations, How the Native New World Shaped Early North America, and Seeing Red, Indigenous Land, American Expansion, and the Political Economy of Plunder in North America, the latter of which was a finalist for the 2023 Pulitzer Prize in History. Our second speaker is Jonathan Quint, a recent PhD graduate from the University of Michigan's History Department and a research associate for the 1817 Project. A historian of early America, he is working on a book project that documents the emergence of the Indigenous American Canadian borderlands in the Detroit and Michilimackinac regions during the late colonial and early Republic periods. Cheyenne Travioli is a second-year PhD student in the Department of American Culture. A citizen of the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe, she studies Indigenous history stretching from the 19th century to the present day. Veronica Williamson is a PhD candidate in the Department of Germanic Languages and Literatures. And while her dissertation focuses on contemporary migration to Germany, she joined the 1817 Project due to her longstanding interests in the public humanities and in museum studies. She is a citizen of the Chickasaw Nation of Oklahoma. And last, but certainly not least, Gabrielle Ione Hickman is a visual artist and a first-year PhD student in the History Department. Her research and creative practices focus on Indigenous and African American pasts, presents, and futures in the Great Lake regions from the 18th to the early 20th century. Please join me in welcoming the 1817 Project team.
So as I mentioned, the 1817 project, which explores the transfer of land from Anishinaabe peoples to the University of Michigan through the 1817 Treaty of Fort Meigs. 1817 project currently encompasses two main research areas, one focusing on 19th century politics of land dispossession, and the other tracking the university's shifting relations with Native American students and tribal communities in the Great Lakes region throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. It's been a real pleasure for us to have a chance to share some of this important work. We're looking forward to sharing that with you this evening. As a starting point, I'd like to tell you a little bit about this kind of very large research project, an interdisciplinary research project that the university has taken on with the Inclusive History Project. This is university-wide research and public engagement initiative sponsored by the University of Michigan's President's Office, the National Center for Institutional Diversity, the IHP's work to tell the 200 plus years of history of the University of Michigan, as well as its national and global impacts, necessarily stretches across all disciplines, schools, colleges, as well as the 3 campuses and Michigan Medicine. The IHP was launched in July of 2023 and now includes 12 major project sites, including this one, the 1817 project. The IHP also has major projects on the histories of Hill Auditorium, athletics, and the African American and Jewish student experience, as well as extensive colonial involvements in places like the Philippines. The Inclusive History Project is already one of the largest and most comprehensive university history initiatives operating today. When this initiative was launched 2 years ago, the IHP Framing Committee explicitly named the question of the university's 1817 origins in relation to Native American land dispossession as the highest priority for the project. This is why the IHP began with the 1817 project in the fall of 2023. This is also why the IHP has invested considerable energy, resources, expertise, and collaborative effort into supporting the work of our presenters, who are pleased to share their work with you here tonight. Before we dive in, let me also name some of my colleagues on the 1817 project. First, I want to name my fellow PIs, Bethany Hughes, an assistant professor of American culture, and Eric Hemingway, who's the director of repatriation, archives, and records for the Little Traverse Bay Bands of Odawa Indians, both of whom have helped to build these research projects and presentations that you're about to hear. Second, I want to thank the members of the 1817 Advisory Committee. In addition to the 3 PIs, this group includes Ephraim Brammer, assistant dean of Rackham, Michelle Cassidy, an associate professor of Native American history at Central Michigan and University of Michigan alum, Jay Cook, professor of U.S. history at the University of Michigan and the director of research for the IHP in Ann Arbor, Matthew Fletcher, professor of American culture and the Harry Burns Hutchins collegiate professor of law, Jalen Green, a grad student with the Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy, and finally Deborah Richmond, who's a tribal historian for the Burt Lake Band of Odawa and Ojibwe Indians. This project it represents an outgoing effort to not only bring in scholars across the United States, across the university system, but also to work with tribal historians, tribal educators. Also, we've been reaching out to state and county educators throughout Michigan in the hopes of drawing them into this project. We're both creating research and information that can be used for them in public instruction in the K-12 level, but also we're trying to create these kind of bridges so that our research is in touch with the tribal communities that remain in Michigan State. And we've been, from the beginning, a collaborative process working with these different constituencies, as well as with scholars and research at the university. So before I transfer this or wrap things up and transfer this over to Jonathan, I want to say a couple things about why Michigan and why the University of Michigan. This history is really important in terms of understanding our nation's history. And the histories that we're looking at tonight, specifically surrounding the Treaty of Fort Meigs that helped to establish the university, occurred at a real pivotal time in American history. This is the era of Indian removal, which happens throughout the southeastern part of the United States, or what we should be called the Old Southwest. The Old Northwest, or what we might think of now as the Great Lakes, doesn't undergo Indian removal in the same fashion, in part because the demography of the region is different. It settles much slower. There isn't a big explosive need for land as there was with the cotton explosion in the southeastern colonies, the development of cotton extraction and production industries centered around slavery, chattel slavery. The University of Michigan, or the state of Michigan, is a good example of this. Founded as a territory in 1805, there were less than 5,000 people in the territory. As late as 1820, there are still under 10,000 people in the territory. And by the laws of the Old Northwest Ordinance, you had to have 60,000 to become a state. And so it's not till after the Erie Canal is completed in 1825 that the population of Michigan really begins to grow. And we have settlers pouring into the state. So about 1830, we've gone from about 9,000 to about 80,000 settlers just in the lower peninsula alone of Michigan territory. And so between this period of being established as a territory and becoming a state in 1837, Michigan undergoes a pretty rapid transformation after about 20 years of relatively slow growth. And that transformation is executed largely through a series of treaties that extinguish native title to land. Virtually all the state is regarded as having being in the possession of native peoples in 1805. By 1837, there are only a few small reservations left, with the rest of that land being transferred to the public domain of the United States. This is where the University of Michigan gets the land grants through the 1817 treaty. These are sections of land that have been surveyed by the federal government, and that treaty stipulated that 2 sections of land would go to the university to facilitate the development of a university in Michigan. This wasn't land that the university was built upon. Rather, that was land given to the university as an asset to be sold so that the money could be used to finance and develop the university. And one of the things that's so important about this is that method of financing and capitalizing the development of all the major institutions of the state itself really occurs through this transfer of land that happens through the treaty process that take land out of Indian hands, put it in public domain, and then sell that land for profit to settlers, to state people, to various state institutions. Institutions that are pivotal to the development, like universities, but also railroad systems, all come from land grants that, again, aren't land that's transferred that institutions are built upon, but rather land that's given to institutions that's then sold, with taking the money from those proceeds to develop anything from canals to universities to railroads to homesteads. So the University of Michigan and the 1817 project fits within this history, and what we aim to do is explore that and look at the extent to which Michigan and Indigenous population, Indigenous history, and American history are all deeply, deeply intertwined. And with that, I will conclude and pass the ball over to Jonathan. Thank you.
Great. Hi, everyone. So for this part of the presentation, we'll shift to basically a showcase of some of the research that's emerged thus far in the 1817 project. All of the speakers here today, all of us were students in an 1817 project history lab graduate course in partnership between the history department and the Inclusive History Project. And so we're essentially presenting research that emerged from that class, which was led by Jay Cook, who's the director of research, for the IHP on the Ann Arbor campus. So as the title of our project suggests, 1817 is a foundational moment in the University of Michigan's early history. The school that became the institution was founded that year in Detroit on August 26th, 1817, and a month later, on September 29th, 1817, the institution received a grant of land from the Anishinaabe people, the Odawa, Chippewa, and Potawatomi, through the 1817 Treaty of Fort Meigs, which is also known as the Treaty of the Maumee Rapids or the Treaty of the Foot of the Rapids. At this time, the institution was called the Catholicopistemiad, or the University of Michigania in Latin. It would undergo several evolutions and renamings in the 1820s until it formally became the University of Michigan. As Michael mentioned, Michigan at this time, Michigan was established as a territory in 1805. In the area's settler population was relatively small. There were about 2,000 to 3,000 settlers living in a narrow strip, basically between Detroit and Monroe, Michigan, and then several hundred settlers up in Michilimackinac region. The population of Michigan overwhelmingly at that time was Indigenous people. They're the demographic majority at this time. So our project is investigating what role the Treaty of Fort Meigs and the land transfer contained in Article 16 of that treaty played in the development of the university. So I'm mainly talking about the early history of the university, the 1810s and 1820s, But as my colleagues will show a little bit later, our research is not just about that original land transfer and moment, but also how the land grant has been recognized, ignored, occluded, eluded, and basically just discussed within the institution's historical memory and the institution's perception of itself. What's really important for my section right now is that the Treaty of Fort Meigs facilitated a transfer of wealth and land. 1,920 acres of Anishinaabe land were granted to the university, and the subsequent sale of that land was really pivotal to the development of the university, providing an important source of capital very early on. The Treaty of Fort Meigs itself was a coercive treaty that led to the cession of millions of acres of Wyandotte land in mostly northwestern Ohio, It was negotiated by Lewis Cass and Duncan MacArthur, the treaty commissioners, with Lewis Cass being the governor of the Michigan Territory at this time. The treaty included a unique article, Article 16, which was a vehicle for the transfer of land described in the treaty text as a grant from the Anishinaabe to the university. I know we often hear that term of gift, a gift of land, especially in university communications and also on a plaque on campus, but the actual treaty article does say grant and not gift. As you'll see later through my colleagues' presentations, the grant has been understood differently over time, and its meaning and purpose has been debated, and there are many different arguments and interpretations about what specifically it meant to the Anishinaabe. As far as we know, this is the only treaty where Indigenous communities specifically transferred land to an educational institution and naming an educational institution, so it's a very symbolic and meaningful event. The land grant is also important to U of M and has great meaning because of the way in which the institution subsequently used that article and that transfer of land to generate capital and then fund its operations. So our research thus far involves studying the context of the grant and how the 1,920 acres it provided to the university were actually used, so converted actually into wealth and capital. The 1,920 acres were provided in 3 one-square-mile sections, which conformed to the public land survey imposed across the United States in 1785. And this was a method for dividing up land brought under American control through treaties. And you can see this map of southeastern Michigan on the screen. You can see those different 1 square mile sections that were sort of the basis for the public land survey system. So through our research, we now can say concretely where U of M actually placed or located those lands it received through the treaty. So again, just looking at the map, these different sections that are numbered with red labels, that indicates where U of M actually located or placed the lands that it received through the treaty. You can see some portions of the land were in Wayne County. Most of the land was in Wayne County, near what's today Trenton, Michigan, in the downriver area. There was also a section of land in the northwest corner of the present-day boundaries of the city of Detroit. It's near Rouge Park, if anyone's familiar with that area. And there was also a section, 2 sections near what's now Farmington, Michigan, in Oakland County. So in placing these different sections on these maps, we're able to get an understanding of why U of M chose these particular parcels. So many of these lands were actually located along rivers, which were essentially the main forms of transportation in this period. Before roads and highways, rivers were really important. So you can see sections near Trenton were on the Detroit River, which is really the main transportation corridor in this region. The sections in Farmington and near what's today Rouge Park were on the Rouge River, so an important form of transportation or method of transportation in this time period. We're also able to look at the surveyor's notes that were surveying these parcels in about 1818 and 1819. So we're able to understand what was actually on the land when U of M claimed it. We have an understanding, or we're able to tell so far that a lot of the land had really good soil quality, so it was really suitable for agriculture. Some of these lands also had many maple sugar groves, so it offered maple sugaring to settlers that would move through the area. And some of these parcels were already cleared of trees or sort of prairie. So these were all parcels that were desirable to settlers with qualities that would attract settlers. And so through that, we can say U of M was very much seeking land that would fetch a high price and that would sell quickly. So after formally taking possession of these lands in 1824, Those lands were sold in the late 1820s and 1830s through a combination of auctions and private sales, often to settlers from New England who were moving into Michigan during this time period. We like to describe this process as like alchemy, so turning a material, in this case indigenous land, into wealth, into capital, and a financial resource that the university can use. Looking at some of the university records, we're also able to tell what U of M did with the proceeds of these land sales. So in a lot of the cases, the proceeds were used to pay instructor salaries. They were used to pay off debts that the institution had accrued with local merchants. And also some of the U of M trustees had lent money, so there was debts being paid off. And there was also mention of repairs to the university's building in Detroit, so a sort of like capital improvements of U of M's buildings. This was a time when U of M had few other financial resources, so the proceeds of the land sales were really foundational to the development of the university, essentially a cash infusion in its really early years. We therefore like to say, and this is something Michael said in his remarks, U of M was built both on and through Native American land, so it's built on land ceded to the United States through the 1807 Treaty of Detroit, but it's also built through that land, so sales of indigenous land to generate capital for the institution. I think one thing I'd like to stress, importantly, at this time in the 1820s and 1830s, U of M actually wasn't yet offering college-level classes. It did have a primary school and what was called the Classical Academy, like a secondary school, operating out of one building of Detroit, but actual college-level classes would come later in 1837, between 1837 and 1841, when U of M moved from Detroit to Ann Arbor. So with these slides, I just want to give a little bit of a preview or a showcase of some of the different primary source materials and archival materials that we use in our work. And this particular slide shows the historical development of U of M's lands in the Trenton area. So the first map you can see on the left is the original surveyor's map from 1819. The different parcels of land that are underlined in red are parcels that U of M held and acquired through the Treaty of Fort Meigs. In Article 16. The map in the middle is taken from the U of M trustees' minutes, which are held at the Bentley, and this shows how U of M took those three sections, broke it down into even smaller tracts and pieces of land, basically to facilitate the quick sale of those lands. So settlers couldn't purchase, just didn't have enough money to buy a large tract, so they could buy these smaller purchases that were broken up. And this image on the far right here indicates where those lands were. It's overlaying that land over what's today Trenton, Michigan, just to give you a sense of where that land was. And you can see that it's much of downtown Trenton. Some other images here, just to briefly discuss. The image of the open page is just a photo I took of the University of Michigan's trustee minutes, which are again held at the Bentley. This page describes the process of selling U of M's land in Farmington, Michigan. So it lists specific terms. There were installment payments for a lot of these purchases. It just gives us a sense of when the land was sold and how much money U of M attained through the sales. The second item is a bound volume, and this is also at the Bentley, and it's what's called a tract book. Tract books are essentially inventories of public domain land that were held in different regions. As U of M or settlers purchased or acquired land, those purchases were recorded in this book by government officials as a way of just keeping track of which lands were available and which lands had been sold. And these books are part of the governmental paperwork and bureaucracy involved in this process. And then finally, the image at the top at auction is just a screenshot of an advertisement from the Detroit Gazette, one of Detroit's earliest papers, where U of M was announcing the sale of some of its land on the Detroit River. Looking at this particular source gives us an understanding of how U of M was marketing and then selling these lands. So this mentions that the land is on the Detroit River, so offering access to the market in Detroit and access to transportation, but it also mentions there was a military highway crossing the tract, so just giving us an understanding of how U of M is marketing this land. So I've mainly been discussing the Treaty of Fort Meigs lands, which were transferred to the university in the 1810s and 1820s, but our research has also focused on U of M's ways in which U of M acquired other lands throughout Michigan. We realized in looking at the Fort Meigs treaty lands that U of M held much land in addition to its the 1,920 acres it secured through the Treaty of Fort Meigs. In fact, the university received about 44,000 acres of land from the federal government, and these were grants of land specifically designed to promote the creation of higher education in new states and territories like Michigan and also throughout the Midwest. In this map here, it's really the start of our effort to actually map where those different parcels were. So each of those red squares on the screen represents one square mile parcel that U of M held in different regions of the state. And so we just get an understanding of where those lands actually were. So in Michigan, these lands were provided specifically through an 1833 law granting land for the establishment of what was called a seminary of learning, the University of Michigan. And of course, U of M wasn't alone. It wasn't the only institution of higher education that was receiving these grants of land. In the early 19th century, many institutions throughout the Midwest received these grants. We do think it's interesting that given Michigan is acquiring these lands in the 1820s and 1830s, this is very early relative to the 1862 Morrill Act, which establishes land-grant colleges, for example, MSU or the University of California system. This is occurring, U of M is receiving these grants of land much earlier in the 1810s and 1820s, so we're wondering if perhaps U of M might have been a blueprint or model that later informed the Morrill Act, for example. So just to conclude here and wrap up, if we recognize that this land was brought under American control through treaties, we can see that U of M is very much wrapped up in, paralleling, and involved with colonization and settlement throughout the Midwest, and particularly Michigan. It's benefiting from indigenous dispossession and the acquisition of indigenous land, whether the federal land grants from the government or the Article 16 land grant between U of M and different tribal communities. So for U of M, many other institutions, like Michael mentioned, state governments, local governments, and even ordinary settlers moving into this space, the acquisition and sale of indigenous land was a key resource and a pathway to development and growth as people are moving into and settling in these areas. So I'll turn it over to Gabrielle. Thank you.
Okay, so as my colleague Jonathan has established, U of M benefited from colonization, indigenous dispossession, and stolen land, alchemizing it into wealth and or capital. And so as we've worked to understand how U of M came to be established in the colonial landscape of 19th century Detroit, we realized that UM also benefited from the institution of slavery in colonial Detroit, the Michigan Territory, and the broader Old Northwest. Because after dispossessing the Anishinaabe of their land, prominent Detroit families needed labor to work it, and that was labor that they also stole. So on this slide, these are the names of 3 people who were enslaved in 19th century Detroit: a Negro man named Pooh, 2 Pawnees women named Susan and Charlotte, and Pawnees means that these women were indigenous. And so their names are listed in the Articles of Incorporation of the Abbott family business in 1789. And James Abbott Sr. arrives in Detroit in 1768, and so kind of sort of not far from here. In downtown Detroit in 1789, he establishes this aforementioned business with his son Robert. And in this document, or in this photo is pulled from the larger sort of Articles of Incorporation of their business. And in the section here, James Sr. and Robert, again his son, were directing how their sort of shared estate would be metered out should anything happen to them. And their enslaved peoples were listed before the Abbott family's cattle, horses, household furniture, and merchandise. And so this tells us not only that the Abbott family were enslavers, but also how important their enslaved peoples were to their livelihood. James Abbott Jr., who I'm going to talk more about in just a second, would later join the business that his father and brother established, and at that point it becomes Abbott and Sons. And so their family business was involved in the fur trade, the Indian trade, land speculation, auctions, a brewery, the shipping industry, and mercantile trading in Detroit. Their businesses spanned across Michigan territory, with Samuel, who's another son, operating out of Mishimiliac or Mackinac. And the family had land holdings all the way to Fort Wayne, Indiana, and Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin. And so in this way, the Abbott family is very representative of many of UM's early trustees, donors, and administrators in terms of the businesses that they were involved with, as well as the sort of breadth of their land holdings. And as I mentioned, after dispossessing the Anishinaabe of their land, the Abbotts and other prominent Detroit families needed enslaved labor to work it. And so the Abbotts enslaved people from when they arrived in Detroit in the 1760s until the 1810s when U of M was being established, and the institution of slavery persisted in Michigan until the 1840s after Michigan became a state. And just to reiterate, in Michigan/Detroit, enslavement was of both Indigenous and African peoples, with Indigenous peoples being the majority of those who were enslaved. And so once the college at Detroit was, or U of M, was established and developed in part through Article 16 of the Treaty of Fort Meigs, UM benefits from wealth from slavery through donations to the institution that come from prominent Detroit families, prominent Detroit enslavers like James Abbott Jr., whose family wealth was derived in part from the labor of enslaved peoples. And so you can sort of see on this slide the image is bad, but that's just because of how the source is in the archive. James Abbott Jr. pledged $25 a year for 10 years in aid of the University of Michigania in 1817, sort of shortly after the university was established through the Treaty of Fort Meigs. And our research shows that he donated around $300 to U of M's endowment, which would be around $7,500 today. And that doesn't seem like a lot, probably in 2025 dollars, but in 1817, like this was a huge sum of money. And so Abbott and other Detroit enslavers were also involved in the early administration of UM. You can see here in this image on the bottom right that James Abbott Jr. served as a trustee and visitor to the first primary school of the city of Detroit, because as Jonathan mentioned, early on U of M was really involved in K-12 education. And so as a trustee and visitor to the primary school around 1817, Abbott serves on a committee to examine the buildings of the academy and report on its present condition, and to recommend the best mode of recurring it from decay, and also the mode of raising funds and finishing the building. James Abbott Jr. also serves as treasurer of UM from 1820 to 1823. And I'll just mention here that as far as we know, right now, no enslaved peoples built UM's campus in Detroit or Ann Arbor, but it was the capital of enslavers in Detroit and Greater Michigan Territory that supported U of M. And so James Abbott Jr. and others, including Lewis Cass, who was the governor of Michigan Territory and president of U of M's Board of Trustees, in addition to at least 13 of UM's early trustees, benefactors, administrators, etc., were enslavers. These are their names, some of which you will no doubt be familiar with: Lewis Cass, Henry Schoolcraft, Augustus Woodward, General Alexander Macomb, Joseph Campeau, James Abbott Jr., Solomon Sibley, John R. Williams, Austin E. Wing, James May, George McDougall, Charles Larned, and some of the members of Zion Lodge No. 1. These men were prominent fixtures in colonial Michigan. They were territorial governors and judges, merchants. James Abbott Jr. is the postmaster of Detroit, and they're also veterans of the War of 1812. And they were deeply invested in this colonial project of state building, or what Dr. Michael Witkin, who we heard from earlier, has termed the political economy of plunder. These men also had huge personal land holdings throughout Michigan Territory and the broader Old Northwest, land holdings that were acquired through quote-unquote purchases of land from Indigenous peoples, and then were worked by people that they enslaved. So they had enslaved people working on stolen land and used the capital from both to generate wealth for themselves and their family that they then donated to U of M. So it's in this way that U of M benefits from both indigenous dispossession and the institution of slavery in Detroit, the Michigan Territory, and the broader Old Northwest. The institution sold the land that it received from the Anishinaabe through the coercive Treaty of Fort Meigs, and then accepts donations from prominent Detroit families who enslaved indigenous and African peoples on that same land. So I'm going to pass it over to my colleague Veronica now.
I hope you all bear with me as we jump 150 years forward. So this jump will hopefully illustrate some of the ways that these treaties in history, now over 200 years old, carry substantial weight through the past and into the present. And for my portion of this presentation, I'm going to highlight just one moment of acute treaty awareness which emerged during the early 1970s student activism. And student activism was not unusual at this time in the wake of the Civil Rights Movement, the 1968 student protests, and the American Indian Movement. And Michigan was no exception. Is that better? Okay. On Michigan's campus, this energy emerged through various student actions, including the Black Action Movement in spring 1970, which you can see a headline from the Michigan Daily here, as well as a petition titled How to Make College Material, submitted to Regents by the student group Chicanos at Michigan in spring of 1971. And what I will focus on now, Native student activism spearheaded by Anishinaabe student Paul Johnson in May 1971. In many ways, Paul Johnson was well suited for this type of work. He had completed his bachelor's degree and played football for Michigan. After finishing that degree, he began working as an assistant football coach here. At the same time, he pursued master's degree in education and social work, and he worked as an assistant in the admissions office. So all of this likely provided insight into the shortcomings in Native student retention and recruitment, as well as an awareness of how the university administration itself operated. And this quote is from a 16-page document written and circulated by Johnson to the regents and administration, and it summarizes the kind of mood of the time and the continued relevance of the treaty into the 1970s. Johnson writes, "The Indian has been totally ignored by this university, but the same university does not hesitate to publish the fact that it was established by the Treaty of 1817 at Fort Meigs. In actuality, this university was founded on lies, deceit, fraud, and more of the same broken promises handed to Indian people." And his proposal, much like the one circulated by the Chicanos at Michigan group shortly before, inverted institutional narratives, namely that Indigenous students were not underqualified or underprepared for the university, but rather that the university was lapsing in its responsibility to recruit Native students and to protect discrimination once they were on campus. And this is a second quote from that report. The part in orange reads, "The implied rationale has been that there is something wrong with the Indian student or his family. There is never the possibility suggested that something is wrong with the schools or the system for that matter." Ooh, not enough hands. And while Johnson's proposal raised awareness of the issue on campus, the administration at the time was not concerned necessarily directly about the content of the proposal, which outlines specific requests for more support, but also they were concerned about coalition building potential among underserved minority groups. And the Bentley Library has numerous sources that are particularly productive to understand kind of administrative responses to student unrest, which I'll eventually focus more on. But this slide shows a letter from William Haber, who was special advisor to the executive offices at the time, to Alan Smith, who was VP for Academic Affairs, as well as Robin Fleming, who was then UM president. You can see I've pointed this arrow. There's this sort of caution of coalition building in response to all these petitions being filed. And so it was not until Johnson actually filed a lawsuit against UM seeking to enforce compliance with the treaty that people began to take a more active note of Native activism and discontent on campus as an independent issue worthy of attention. And Johnson's report and eventual lawsuit circulated in campus and local and regional press throughout the following decade. And you can see a range of headlines here from the very first summer when it was launched. So we have Indians threaten you with suit, Indians sue you, UM sued to educate Indians, and University of Michigan reneges on Indian treaty. Between 1971 and 1981, this issue and case was taken up within the university, the county, and the state. And ultimately, the court case could be considered unsuccessful from a legal standpoint that looks only at the specific case itself. After a decade-long court that moved from the Washtenaw County Circuit all the way up to the Michigan Supreme Court, the court ultimately ruled that there was insufficient evidence of fraud or malfeasance on the part of the university. But I do want to point out that in between the case being launched and the court's final decision, we do have Michigan as a state announcing the Native American Indian Tuition Waiver Program, which is now known as the Michigan Indian Tuition Waiver, which partially addresses some of the concerns of Johnson's advocacy work. And so that kind of shows how while the court case was insufficient, there was also movement in other ways, and the advocacy had a broader impact than just that one case. And I want to briefly highlight two key debates of this case. This is just to give a sample of how, due to the age of the treaty, the case was particularly interesting. And believe me when I say that everyone had to become a historian and attempt to understand UM's history, a lot of the stuff that Jonathan just went over, in order to kind of engage with this case. And so one key question was who even made the agreement in the original treaty? And this played a major role in the court case. Arguments were set forth that the University of Michigan was only 1 month old when the treaty was signed, and therefore Lewis Cass acted in his capacities not as a founder of the fledgling university, but rather as a treaty commissioner on behalf of the US government. And therefore, the university, according to this logic, was not party to the treaty and could not make any undertaking express or implied. And so if we follow this logic, recourse for Indian education should be to the government and legislative powers, not the university. And you kind of see that emerging in the background with the Native American Tuition Waiver Program. A second key debate was a trust established? The plaintiff argued that Article 16 created a trust, which the university had lapsed in maintaining, but the defendant denied that any trust was made and that the lands were a gift. And I'll recall that Jonathan mentioned what is written in the treaty is that it's a grant. And so everyone's kind of wondering, what does that mean in today's term? What did that mean in historical terms? But this idea that a trust was not created, that it was a grant, that it was a gift, became the defense's main argument. And this letter on the right side of the screen is hard to read from where you're sitting, but it's one example of how the lawsuit was a topic of conversation and debate among the highest level of university governance. So this was written by William Cudlip, who was a regent at the time and an attorney, and it's to Roderick Dane, who was serving as UM's general counsel for this case. And Cudlip is sort of providing his personal expertise and advice to Dane on what it means to use a trust and how you can legally define a trust or not. So Paul Johnson he sued the university saying they were not in compliance with Article 16 of the treaty. So they were not upholding that promise to educate Native Americans hereafter. And that was shown by low student enrollment, low retention, lack of tuition waivers, that kind of thing, yeah. And so debates and updates related to the case are present in letters like that previous example, to and from all sorts of administrators, as well as in monthly litigation memos penned by Roderick Dane and submitted to the regents. And these are often very kind of dry with minimal updates. The update on the left basically has a court filing update, but they occasionally reveal this kind of glimmer of fascination with the novelty of the case and the age of questions being asked. So in this example on the right, Roderick Dane has kind of editorialized it. He says, simultaneous briefs are due on September 29th, 1978, 161 years to the day from when the date born on the treaty. So there's these kind of glimmers of fascinations among the administrators. And so, oops, I've lost my place, I'm sorry. And so these last two images gesture to how there's this rich institutional history present in archival documents of previous administrations, and they help us to kind of think through a few questions. For example, how did the university understand its own history and historical obligations at that point in time? To what extent was the university concerned about proposals like Paul Johnson's and the issues raised by minority students? And also, how did administrators approach such student activism? Were they thinking about it as a public relations image or issue, as a moral issue, as a financial issue, as a legal issue? With that, I will pass it to Cheyenne.
So going off of what Veronica introduced to you all, my research for the IHP looks at Native student enrollment or Native student trends. And so, is this better? Okay. So original research questions going into this project were influenced by my own undergraduate experience here at the University of Michigan and as an Indigenous student. So I often found in my undergraduate experience, often looking for others like me in the classroom setting, and then again, questioning where are we and why aren't we here? Why am I the only Indigenous student in this class? So this kind of made me dive in a little deeper with my questions, and so I was wondering, what departments are Indigenous students enrolling in? For me, for example, I do focus on the humanities, so I was curious, are we enrolling in STEM programs? Are we, sticking with humanities? And then what are those departments doing to appeal to Indigenous students? What does their admission process look like? And what can these departments do to admit more students? And have they done anything to necessarily appeal? And so I wanted to go ahead with these questions and see if I could find any trends within the archive with any of the documents that the Bentley Historical Library has. And then I wanted to see if I could create a timeline showcasing these trends. And so I was recommended by one of our archivists to start with the creation of NASA, or the Native American Student Association, the Red Power movement, and as Veronica introduced to you all, the Johnson case. So I originally wanted to start in the early 1900s, but that is a lot of information. So again, going off the archivist's recommendation, I did start with the 1970s, so I did have to, shorten my passion a little bit. And so what you're looking at right now is, let me see, is the Bentley Historical Library's Excel sheet. So I was given this kind of as motivation or encouragement of what the Bentley Historical Library currently has. And so again, my passions were high. I was like, this is it. I'm going to find Native American students. However, in the archive, I did run into the issue of defining who Native students were. There's really no established record of Native students. We ran into the issue of, this either earlier on or even within the 1970s decade. We don't have the demographic enrollment cards yet. So I'm going to use their template as a model. They also use this for the African American Student Project. Yes. So looking at the documents within the archive, that first box that I was recommended, I'm looking at documents like the Native American Advocate. And again, we have, if you can see right here, we have the signature of Moose. So Moose shows up quite often in the Native American Advocate. So I'm looking for names, Indigenous names, similar to Moose. But then I ran into the issue of, can I solely go off last names? Can I solely go off first names, especially Indigenous sounding names? And then I ran into the archival question of whose right is it to define who's Native? Even though I am Indigenous, do I have that right? Do I hold that right? And then going in, I did have the concern of if I encountered photographs, again, I might stumble upon a Native American who's a little more white passing, like myself, or even Afro-Native students. They might present solely as Black, but also they hold our Indigenous identity. So again, who gets to define how someone identifies within our archives? So my collection so far has noted those who do identify explicitly, like Moose, within the Native American Advocate. So, as I've said, these are my concerns. I am, missing essential information. There is a gap in my data. But again, I am looking at students who are explicitly noted as Native American, like students like Moose or David Truer, who was a U of M PhD candidate, who has gone on postgraduate and has written books. But again, I'm looking at the Native American Advocate. Who were these students? What were their voices like? What were they wanting, voicing, demanding then in the 1970s? And then again, students like Moose were extremely vocal of their wants and needs as a student on the U of M campus here in Ann Arbor. And similar to present day and the demands of our Native American student body here on U of M's campus, there are demands for a cultural center, safe spaces to hold our Indigenous identities, and overall to find community and a home away from home, because we are far removed from our communities in Ann Arbor. Students like Moose also spoke of demands and collaboration with the American Culture Department, where I currently am getting my PhD, and for the creation of their Native American Studies program. Also, the hiring of more Native faculty. This is an issue still today. And so as an Indigenous student within the American Culture Department, this meant a lot to me, knowing that, you know, there was demands decades ago. And then I don't have it up here, but other documents that I did look at were from our Anishinaabe-Moan language course. And so I scanned the enrollment course to, again, look for Indigenous sounding names, but again, run into the issue of might not have Indigenous names. So again, document cannot, you know, fully be trusted as it doesn't explicitly state who is a Native student at the time. So ending, this is my last slide. This is what I have been able to come up with just within that first archival box that I started with. So again, just going off of who is explicitly named as being Indigenous or identifying, again, didn't live up to my passions of reaching what the Bentley Historical Library has with their own Excel sheet, but I think this is a good start, starting with the 1970s. And then just ending remarks I have for the IHP project and for everyone involved. I think that, you know, my data kind of reiterates the concern of how can the university further repair its relationships with Indigenous communities within the state of Michigan and beyond the Great Lakes. And so possibilities, you know, for me can include maybe U of M Ann Arbor or all three campuses host a prospective Native fair. Andrea Wilkerson of NASA kind of does this already. But again, maybe the university themselves can host their own or even collaborate with youth programs within our tribes here in Michigan. To inform, you know, what youth our universities are, you know, currently looking for in their admission processes, what extracurricular activities they recommend. But again, repairing that relationship of not making Native students feel inferior, but again, just kind of offering them resources. We kind of have this with our summer bridge program here. But again, I'm kind of arguing for maybe before our Indigenous students are admitted to the college. And then for me personally, with my own experience, again, back here for my PhD program, the hiring of more Native faculty. I do work with Matthew Fletcher, he is my advisor, but again, I am focusing on Indigenous studies, and Native faculty are hard to come by, and I do need that for my research and finding community still here on campus. So again, you know, there's a lot to be done to repair our relationships with our communities.
So I just have a brief concluding comment before moving over to questions. But so just in light of all of this research and still the research that's to come and emerge from the project, where does all this research leave us? At the heart of the 1817 project and the broader Inclusive History Project, of which we're just a part, is a commitment to research, engagement, and repair. We take all of these components very seriously and have been talking about them and thinking about them since the very beginning of the project. Our focus today is just, you know, a showcase of some of the emerging research that we've undertaken, and we're really grateful to the Bentley for the opportunity and the Detroit Observatory for the opportunity to be here and share some of these insights into U of M's history. But I just want to emphasize that really this is just the beginning of the work for the 1817 project. Over the coming years, we have several major projects planned, including a pair of national conferences on the 19th and 20th century histories of the University of Michigan. The first conference in winter 2026, still in development, will be strongly focused on telling more honest and sophisticated histories of the connections between colonization, Native American dispossession, and the creation of the university. But we're also thinking about how Native history is taught statewide, how histories of colonization are taught, and how we understand the history of the University of Michigan at a state level and a local level. So this conference will foster conversations between K-12 and social studies educators, Native American and Indigenous studies faculty, history faculty, School of Ed faculty, and bring together those groups and hopefully establish relationships that are reciprocal, respectful, and informed by conversations between all of those different groups. So this approach is shaping other major projects we have in the works beyond those specific conferences, including a digital platform to disseminate our research and just learn more about U of M's history, as well as teaching materials for K through 12 educators, media, different forms of media such as podcasts and videos, and other resources just to share this history that we're uncovering through our work in archives at the Bentley, the Clements, and other archives and libraries in Michigan. So we invite you to check out the Inclusive History Project website, and specifically our project webpage, the 1817 Project webpage, where you can just learn a little bit more about the project, as well as other IHP projects, and just learn about our events and programming and see different resources and updates which we've been posting to the site. And I think just finally, just thanks to my co-presenters, it's been a great experience doing all this research with you all, learning all this material, but we're also part of a much broader team within the 1817 Project and Inclusive History Project, and so this is just to give you a sense of the size of our team and how everyone's involved in this project and working together. So thank you very much.
Well, so, wow, that's really, you guys covered a lot of ground in this. I'm not quite sure to start other than say it's really always great to see the Bentley get featured heavily in these. But one question I have is you have done so much, and really just this is your first year of really diving into the 1817 Project. And what are some of the most surprising things you found in each of your research? I mean, you each do such different things. Maybe it's all as you expected, I don't know.
I feel like one of the surprising things that I found when I was looking into the Abbott family was that in 1811, Robert, who I mentioned, Robert Abbott, who works in the Abbott and Sons business, is granted a guardianship, quote unquote, of two black girls, Elizabeth and Nancy, alias Bell. And this was really interesting to me because, like, who are they? And it very clearly specifies that they're black, and then that they were given guardianship of them. And so that was really interesting because around sort of the 1810s, like, the sort of attitudes in Detroit and Michigan Territory around, like, the institution of slavery sort of start to shift. And so you have, it you know, kind of starts to be less popular. And so but then, like, people were also still trying to either get more enslaved peoples or keep their enslaved peoples, or, you know, you see things where they're, like, transferring them as they're, you know, doing, like, land transfers and things like that. And so I'm really kind of, like, haunted by, you know, this archival source that names these two women in terms of, like, who were they? Why were they, you know, quote unquote, put in Robert's care as a guardian? Is this just a way of naming them or, like, you know, transferring them to him, you know, because they were enslaved, but it's kind of like a way of hiding that, just, you know, because of how the landscape is shifting at the time. So they kind of haunt me, and I'm hoping to be able to find out more about them as I keep doing the work. But yeah.
I would say I started on the 19th century team, and this would not have surprised me there, but then I pivoted to the 20th century research and, like, this work on the 1970s. I think what actually surprised me most is how even in that kind of more recent history, there are still like these huge gaps. So I can really only talk about the institutional history of that case with the documents that exist still. And that surprised me when I made the jump to the more recent history, how there still are these kinds of like, the questions you can ask or the questions you can answer are limited by the things that we have access to. And without kind of finding new private or personal archives that we can tap into, you kind of have to contend with that. And I feel like this is maybe also a big part of Cheyenne's project, was working with what exists and how that then affects what you can answer and what questions left open. And that's also interesting, is what's left open can be really powerful, but it's kind of a constant tension, hoping you'll find that document that can say something about like a different side or a different angle, or yeah.
Yeah, going off of what Veronica has shared, again, what do we have available within the archive? I originally went in with my passions, wanting to create an established Excel sheet similar to what the Bentley has created, and I didn't quite get there, but instead, to my surprise, I was fortunately able to kind of build this relationship with the students of NASA in the 1970s. And though they're probably still alive, again, it just resonated with my own feelings being a student, an Indigenous student at the University of Michigan. And again, just kind of reassuring to feel like my demands and my necessities that I'm voicing now were once, demanded decades ago. And so it reassured that, there is continuation and erasure and our silence. But again, kind of felt heard by past Indigenous students.
I think maybe just two things really quickly in relation to Gabrielle's presentation, just showing a few of the enslavers and just the individuals involved in the governance of U of M, like the Board of Trustees and the president. Just recognizing that there's a lot of overlap between that Board of Trustees and basically the territorial and then later state officials or administrators, so Lewis Cass or Henry Schoolcraft. Lucius Lyons is another individual, and just seeing how, as they're involved in the governance, building up the institution, they're also, essentially the leaders of developing the territory and state of Michigan. So just thinking about how U of M is connected to that larger work that they're doing, and the relationship between U of M and the development of the state has been really eye-opening to see just the overlap between those two groups. Yeah, I think that's.
It's very, yeah. Now, one of the other kind of themes that connects all your work and your answers to the previous question is, we have these gaps, we have these silences, both deliberate and not so deliberate. I'm kind of curious, so you're starting to shed light on this history of U of M and these histories, I should say. What have been some of the responses as you started to share your work? Either from other students, the university administration or the public. What sort of responses have you been getting?
We'll hear some questions later in this presentation, but I think one of the things we've also been doing through the IHP is doing class visits, going around to different classes at all three of the campuses, and just sharing a little bit about our project and introducing some of the work that we've been doing, just like we did this evening, and just basically interacting with students and teaching them this history and recognizing that they didn't really know as much about the early history of the institution. And when I started graduate school, I didn't either. So I think people are actually very eager to understand, particularly the early history of the institution. Everyone will know, it's founded in 1817, it's on the crest. But sort of beyond that, I think there's room to just teach people a little bit more, and people do seem interested so far.
Yeah, I think one thing that I'll add is that people, how do I want to say this? So there's a very strong myth that sort of Michigan, especially with regard to African American or Black history, sort of starts with freedom. There's this myth that we're this stop on the Underground Railroad, and enslaved peoples were coming here to be free or cross the border to Canada, which is true, but the history doesn't start there, right? People were enslaved here, just like in the South, the Northeast, other places around the country. And I think a lot of people don't know that, and are either very surprised by it, but surprised in a way of almost like disbelief, of like sort of not believing it. And I'm like, oh, but like I have this source, that like literally proves it. And so people have very strong reactions to that, because I think that knowledge doesn't live in like the public consciousness of this place in the same way that it does, if we were in Georgia or Alabama, for example. So it's really important for me, both through the university, but also just like the broader region, as someone who's like studying to be a historian of the Midwest and of the Great Lakes region, to really like get this history out there and kind of shift that narrative, and have this be like as sort of prominent in the public consciousness as the Underground Railroad or some of these other things are. And then also, of course, that like Indigenous people were the majority of people who were enslaved, which I think is also something that we don't typically think about with slavery in the U.S. We think of it as being primarily African and African descended peoples, and they were enslaved here. But I think it's also important to like sort of point to some of these things that make how slavery happened in this place distinct, as well as like putting that into the sort of the public consciousness in mind.
Well, I mean, I have a lot of questions, but I do know I should be a good host. So I'm going to open it up to questions from our audience, both here and in person. Please raise your hand and wait until one of our wonderful docents brings you the microphone, because that way everybody, both here and on the live stream, will be able to hear your question. So.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. I was interested that when you define archives, you define them basically as formal archives at the University of Michigan and only Michigan's archives. Whereas especially since natives or black people didn't have a written tradition, I think you probably have to open up your definition of archives in a way that also includes rituals, oral histories, memoirs, and things like that, songs. So I was wondering if you are doing any of that, because otherwise you would automatically privilege the white settlers, who did put everything together and hegemonize it in the first place. Thank you.
Just to say that, yes, 100%. This is something that I brought up very frequently during our class, that we have to engage with oral histories and other traditions. And so hopefully that will happen and become a part of the project. It's definitely, I think, something that we're all conscious of and want to pull into the work. It's just about establishing relationships, especially if we're going to be asking people to share their stories with us. So doing that in a way that's like reciprocal and responsible and all of that. But that's absolutely been something that has been on our minds, and definitely on my mind, for sure. So, yeah.
Yeah, and probably Jonathan could speak more to this, but there are 2 like oral history projects going on to kind of collect different types of information or different types of knowledges. But I think it has been a matter of what can we start working with, and then how can we expand that and maybe add a lot more nuance or perspectives to that as the project continues to build. But that's absolutely a conversation that's happening, yeah.
If you don't mind me asking, what are the oral history projects?
Sure, I think one of the IHP projects, although it's not specifically related to the 1817 project, it's run by Professor Bethany Hughes in the Department of American Culture. She actually gave a Making Michigan lecture last year here, which you can look up. But that particular project is about collecting oral histories of current Native students on campus, and I believe also Native alums, documenting, for example, their experiences on campus. I'm not sure that it's, like I said, specifically looking to the Treaty of Fort Meigs, but I think it would be interesting I like that question because, I mean, some of my work, all of my work is focused in this moment on the colonial sources, like the trustees of U of M writing about this moment and what they're thinking about. But we don't have Native perspectives on the treaty at that time. So I think it would be interesting to talk with Veronica and see, maybe get into a little bit more detail about Paul Johnson's argument and how he's making that argument, and maybe he in the 1970s looked at people from his community or throughout Michigan, you know, as a way of developing that lawsuit and making that argument. So I think that would be a way to maybe bridge the early history with some of the history that you've been looking at. Yeah.
Occasionally, you do find traces of different stories even within these kind of more traditional archives on campus. For example, you mentioned Lucius Lyons earlier, who was a colonial agent in the mid-1800s, but kind of buried within his collection at the Clements Library are these like transcripts of family genealogies and histories in the region, because they were trying to get treaty rights. And so you also kind of have these pockets that you can pull out too that are gesturing to a different history, to different agents in this story too.
What about church records?
There's we've looked a little bit at like Gabriel Richard's parish records, which are housed, there's quite a few in Detroit, and there's also copies at Central Michigan University. So yes, and yeah.
Thank you very much. Amazing panel and project. Stephen Modell, School of Public Health. When half a year ago I went to the American Public Health Association annual meeting in Minneapolis, it started out with a recognition of the Native Americans who originally occupied that land. But this went so much deeper than just a recognition in terms of place, time, and person. I have a question for the last panelist. In your very last slide, about 2/3 of the way down, you had a name in one of the rows, and next to it was the nickname Moose, which reminded me of your very first slide. And I'm wondering whether that row that contained Moose, you believe was the person who was captured in your very first slide. And my related question is, when an individual nicknamed themselves Moose, do you view that as positively, as an identifier for a very small population that was here on campus, or as negatively as a way of anonymizing the individual?
Thank you for your question. I think Moose willingly went by his name Moose. Oftentimes within our own communities, we are given our own indigenous name. I'm not entirely sure if that was his given Indian name. But he explicitly identified himself as Moose within the Native American Advocate. Now, his real name was mentioned, I think, once, but because I encountered him so often as Moose, I know him as Moose, I address him as Moose. So I think that was, and I can't, again, you know, I question whether if I can even speak for these individuals, even though I am Indigenous. They do hold their own voices within the archives. But to me, I guess I interpreted it as he was pride in his heritage. He was prideful in his identity as an Indigenous student here on campus. And so if we were to look at it now, I would say it's more of like a reclamation process. Like, we're here, we are proud in our identity, we stand with our identity, we stand with our name.
So I'm going to turn to a couple questions from our online audience. We've had a lot of activity in the chat, a lot of interesting questions and comments. One of our online guests asked, how does the phrasing of land grant match with original peoples not believing that land was owned by anyone, much less able to give away or sell? Any agreement by them would be about sharing use. And sort of related to that question, and I don't know if anyone will want to say this or go on record saying this, but should Michigan return the U of M property to the Indigenous tribes and let them govern the property and the university?
could try to answer the first one. How about that? I think that's a really interesting point. Something that I've been thinking about is looking to some of the dictionaries that were produced, including by individuals like John Monteith, the president of U of M when it was established. And his collection at the Bentley, there's a dictionary where he was translating between English and Anishinaabemowin or Ojibwe. And it'd be very interesting to look for a term like grant or anything close to that with a shared or sort of similar meaning. But grant was, of course, an English term that occurs in a lot of treaties. And so the authorship of the treaty and that particular article, there's varied opinions on that. And so I, for myself, am still sort of weighing the different arguments, but I think, there's the interpretation that was sort of inserted by Cass. This whole article is devised by Cass and inserted. So I think it's something we're thinking about, but it's a really good question because there's a lot of unclarity and ambiguity regarding the whole article, much less particular words in the article. So it's something that we're definitely thinking about. Yeah.
I would I don't know who this online viewer is, but you might find the court decision for the Paul Johnson case very interesting because they have to the court itself is doing historical research that says what does it mean to possess land, and then they're defining that in very Euro-American ways, it has to be cultivated to a certain standard. And then of course if you're defining land that way, possession that way, then any other type of possession or public ownership or stewardship will necessarily be excluded, and then the court case is sort of from the outset lost because that's the premise that you're going by. So I guess I would say that's a great question. I'm very interested in how ideas of land stewardship and holding are kind of changing rapidly at this time because of kind of the overlay of these settler perceptions of land. And we are working on some visualization projects that hopefully will kind of talk about how that process mechanically took place over time. So stay tuned for that later. Yeah.
Thank you. I noticed in the university record today it happened at Michigan, and it was about Angel Hall, and they talked about the inscription on the front of the building that is from the Northwest Ordinance, and it says, "This passage from the Northwest Ordinance is a declaration of free, universal public education, and some have called it the, quote, birth certificate of the University of Michigan." And when I read it, I was a little put off by it, and also thinking that there's still a big disconnect happening between the story and kind of the reality, the story that U of M is still telling by that comment, and wondering if you, in all of your work, if you are under the impression or there's the possibility that U of M might start to tell the story differently, perhaps more aligned with reality.
Okay, I'll clarify that I'm speaking for myself, not the 1817 project or the IHP. And I think that that's the hope, right? I think that that's the hope in all of this research. But I mean, I know a question that we've all asked ourselves at different points is various sort of underrepresented or quote-unquote minoritized communities on campus throughout the institution's history have made demands of the institution to be more inclusive. And I think Veronica's presentation really highlights, right, all of the different parties who were doing that. And so part of, I think, what we're hoping happens through our research is that, U of M will be more truthful to the actual history that's happened, and also then, right, take concrete steps to actually respond to the various demands, you know, throughout the decades and centuries in like real and meaningful ways. Some of sort of how the institution responds is like out of our hands, right? So we do the research and we present the historical truth, and then we can make recommendations. I personally sometimes wonder what is the difference of like us making recommendations versus what like Native students asked for in the 70s versus like the recommendations from the Black Action Movement and the right, like what's the difference or the sort of importance in doing it now? And I think internally we sometimes talk about that as like continuing to make a case for the university of like why it needs to sort of to straighten up and fly right? Like why does the institution need to do that? And so I think that that's all of our like personal hopes as we're working on this project. But I can't, you know, I'm not the president or the regent, so I can't say, you know, what they're going to do. But I think that's what we're pushing for and trying to like demonstrate through the research that we're doing.
I think, do you want to add something? Go ahead.
Again, similar to echo Gabrielle. The only response I have is that we need to remember that U of M is a colonial institution, and especially Native peoples and minority students, time immemorial have had to go up against colonial institutions. So regardless if the institution wants to acknowledge the real history or stick to a different history, our people will know the real history either through written form or oral form. So, and we will persist.
I think we might actually end it right there. Thank you all for joining us this evening. Thanks as well to Greg Parker, the director of the Observatory, for being willing to sit in the corner and monitor the live stream. Thanks as well to the wonderful Michigan media team that makes both a live stream possible and a recording they're going to create, which will be sent to everybody who registered for this event and become a permanent YouTube link. You should all get that in an email in about a week. You know, you could share with everybody, you could watch it over again, you could do both. We're now going to bid you all good night, but the original observatory building is going to be open for another half hour. If you've never been, I welcome you to go. It's truly an incredible building. Our undergraduate and graduate student docents do a fantastic job. Unfortunately, it is Michigan, so it's a bit cloudy tonight, so I don't think you'll be able to see much of the telescopes, but you can see the telescopes. For those of you who are watching on live stream, please join us in person soon. We're going to have another Making Michigan in May, and you'll be joined by another committee of very talented writers and researchers on university history from across the campus. But until then, have a wonderful evening, and thank you again for joining us. Take care.